The departure hall at Charles de Gaulle Airport was loud in the way international terminals are loud. 100 languages folded into one long hum, wheels dragging over polished floors, a distant boarding call repeating itself in French and then in English. It was October of 2019, and among the thousands of people moving through Terminal 2E that morning were two Americans who had spent 15 years learning how to survive without an answer. Robert and Diane Carter had flown to Paris for a conference on missing children, one of dozens they had attended since 2004. They were not looking for anything that morning. They were simply walking toward their gate, exhausted, ready to go home. Then Diane stopped. She would later tell investigators that she couldn't explain what made her look twice. A young airport employee, no older than 19, was walking slowly through the terminal beside an older colleague, gesturing toward a departure board for confused travelers. Dark blonde hair, a uniform 2 sizes too big in the shoulders, a patient, slightly crooked smile. And yet, Diane could not move. There is a particular stillness that overtakes a person in the instant before understanding arrives fully. Diane would describe it, months later, as the sensation of the entire terminal falling silent around her, even though nothing around her had actually changed. Robert noticed his wife's stillness before he understood its cause. In 15 years of marriage, forged and reforged by grief, he had learned to read the particular quality of her silences, and this was one he hadn't heard since roughly 2007, the last time a stranger's photograph had made her believe, for a few agonizing hours, that their son had been found. We're going to pause here. Before we return to it, we need to go back 15 years to a small town in Maine, to an afternoon that began like any other and ended a family's sense of safety forever. If you're new here, welcome to Archive 26, where we reconstruct investigative patterns through researched narrative cases. And if you've been here before, thank you for coming back. On May 3rd, 2004, 4-year-old Lucas Carter was at a spring fair in his hometown, a modest gathering of food stalls, a carousel, and a temporary playground set up beside the town square. It was the kind of event where everyone knew everyone, where parents let their guard down because nothing bad had ever happened there before. Diane remembered the weather clearly, mild, slightly overcast, the kind of grey New England sky that makes colors look sharper than they are. She remembered Lucas's red jacket. She remembered laughing with a neighbor for what she believed was no more than a few minutes. When she turned back toward the playground, Lucas was gone. At first, panic wore the shape of ordinary parental worry. He must have wandered toward the carousel, toward the food stalls, toward a friend's mother. Robert circled the square twice, calling his son's name, his voice competing with a local band's soundcheck. It took less than 10 minutes for that ordinary worry to curdle into something else entirely. By the time the local police arrived, nearly 30 minutes had passed since anyone could reliably say they had seen Lucas. Officers began interviewing fairgoers. A perimeter was set. Search dogs arrived within 2 hours. They picked up a scent near the parking area behind the square, a scent that ended abruptly at the edge of the road, as though it had simply been lifted into a vehicle and driven away. No one had seen a car matching that description. No one had seen a stranger near the playground. The single security camera positioned outside the hardware store 2 blocks away captured a low-resolution frame of a dark-colored sedan passing through the intersection nearest the fair at 3:47 p.m. But the image quality made the license plate unreadable, and the make of the vehicle could not be confirmed. Within 24 hours, the disappearance of Lucas Carter had become national news. Volunteers from 3 counties arrived to help search the surrounding forests, the riverbank half a mile from the square, and dozens of rural properties whose owners opened their land willingly, hoping to help, praying they wouldn't find anything at all. They found nothing, not a shoe, not a scrap of the red jacket, not a single conclusive footprint in the soft mud near the tree line that could be tied definitively to a 4-year-old boy. For a small town that prided itself on the idea that nothing terrible happened within its borders, the silence was almost unbearable. There was no ransom note, no phone call, no demand of any kind. In cases of stranger abduction, investigators often rely on a pattern, a motive that reveals itself eventually, whether financial, sexual, or otherwise. Here there was nothing to hold on to, just an empty playground, a red jacket that would never be found, and a family standing at the edge of a mystery with no visible edges. By nightfall, Robert and Diane Carter had given their first police statement. It would not be their last. Over the following decade and a half, they would give dozens more to detectives, to journalists, to FBI liaisons, to true crime researchers, and eventually, to a version of themselves that had learned to speak about their son's disappearance without their voices breaking, not because the pain had lessened, but because they had simply run out of new ways to describe it. What none of them could have known, on that grey afternoon in Maine, was that the boy in the red jacket was, at that very moment, being driven not toward a nearby town, but toward an entirely different life, one built out of silence, false paperwork, and a lie so complete that even Lucas himself would come to believe it. The Carters would spend the next 15 years learning to carry a question that had no visible shape, not a grave to visit, not a diagnosis to manage, simply an absence that refused to resolve itself into any recognizable form of closure. There is no funeral for a child who might, at any moment, still be found. It's worth asking yourself, honestly, how you might have carried that same uncertainty. Would you have allowed yourself to hope year after year? The Carters never fully answered that question. They simply kept living inside it, one ordinary morning at a time, until an ordinary morning in Paris finally offered something else. To understand how a 4-year-old boy could vanish from a crowded town square in under 10 minutes, investigators first had to understand the geography of that Saturday afternoon, not as a map, but as a sequence of ordinary decisions that, in hindsight, formed a corridor no one had thought to guard. The fair itself had been organized by the town's community association for 11 consecutive years. Nothing about the layout had changed. A row of food vendors lined the eastern edge of the square. A small stage hosted a local band that afternoon. And along the northern edge, closest to a narrow access road used mostly by delivery trucks, sat the temporary playground. 3 inflatable structures, a sandbox, and a fenced area meant to keep the youngest children contained while their parents mingled nearby. The fence was low, it had always been low. No one had ever needed it to be anything more than a visual boundary, a polite suggestion rather than a barrier. Later, when investigators reconstructed the layout of that afternoon, they noted something almost unbearable in its simplicity. The access road running along the northern edge of the fairgrounds was rarely used by attendees, reserved mostly for vendors unloading supplies earlier that morning. By mid-afternoon, delivery traffic had ended and the road sat largely unwatched, a quiet seam at the edge of an otherwise carefully supervised gathering. It wasn't hidden or secluded. It was simply the one place where no one happened to be looking at exactly the wrong moment. According to statements gathered afterward, at least 6 adults were within 20 feet of the playground at any given moment between 3:30 and 3:45 p.m. Diane was one of them, standing with a neighbor, Carol Whitfield, whose own children were playing nearby. Carol would later tell police that she remembered Lucas playing near the sandbox at approximately 3:38 p.m. She could not say with certainty when she last saw him after that. This is the detail that would trouble investigators for years. Not a single adult present could identify the exact moment Lucas stopped being visible. There was no scream, no commotion, no visible struggle. Whatever happened, it happened quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention, the signature, detectives would later note, of someone who was neither desperate nor improvising. By 3:52 p.m., Diane had circled the playground twice and begun calling Lucas's name with an urgency that drew the attention of nearby vendors. Robert, who had been near the stage, heard his wife's voice change register before he understood the words. He would later describe it as a sound he'd never heard her make before or since. Not quite a scream, but something underneath a scream, held back by the last thread of hope that this was simply a misunderstanding. It wasn't. Local police arrived within 11 minutes of the first 911 call, a response time later praised by state investigators as unusually fast for a rural department. Officers immediately began a grid search of the square and adjoining streets. A description of Lucas, 4 years old, brown hair, red jacket, blue sneakers, was broadcast to all units within a 15-mile radius. What would you have done in that first hour? standing in a crowd of familiar faces, realizing that one of them might be the last person who saw your son? It's a question the Carters have never fully answered, even now. Diane has said in later interviews that she kept scanning the crowd not for strangers, but for anyone acting strange, a detail that speaks to how quickly a parent's trust can fracture under pressure, even toward people they've known for years. The search expanded rapidly. By early evening, state police had joined local officers, and by the following morning, the FBI's Boston field office had been notified. Given the jurisdictional implications of a potential abduction, search and rescue teams from 3 neighboring counties arrived with cadaver dogs and scent-tracking dogs, working the tree line behind the square and the riverbank a half-mile to the west, where the current ran fast enough in early May to be a genuine concern. For 72 hours, searchers moved through forest, along roads, and through culverts, working in coordinated grids under a command post set up in the town's fire station. Volunteers arrived from towns as far as 40 miles away, many of them parents themselves, unable to stay home while a child was missing nearby. They found nothing that could be tied to Lucas. No clothing, no personal item, no trace evidence along the wooded areas closest to the square. The scent dogs trail, as mentioned earlier, terminated at the parking area behind the fairgrounds, consistent with a vehicle departure, though no vehicle could be definitively linked to the case. It was during this early phase, chaotic, exhausting, driven by adrenaline and dwindling hope, that investigators began the process of interviewing everyone within the family's immediate circle, a standard procedure in cases of this nature, however painful it might be for grieving parents to endure. Among the names on that early list was a man named Michael Dawson, Diane's former partner, whose relationship with her had ended roughly 8 months before Lucas disappeared. At the time, no one in that command post could have known how significant that name would eventually become, or how long it would take for the truth behind it to surface. Carol Whitfield, the neighbor standing closest to Diane that afternoon, would carry her own quiet guilt for years afterward, despite investigators repeatedly assuring her that nothing she did or failed to do could reasonably have prevented what happened. She had, like everyone else at that fair, simply trusted that a low fence and a crowd of familiar faces were enough, a trust most of us extend without a second thought, every single day. By the time the sun set on May 3, 2004, the town's volunteer fire department had converted its main hall into a makeshift command center, folding tables covered in hand-drawn search grids. Thermoses of coffee passed between exhausted officers who had, until that morning, expected nothing more dramatic than a quiet Saturday shift. Michael Dawson was 31 years old in the spring of 2004, employed at a regional logistics company and, according to nearly everyone who knew him, unremarkable in almost every visible way. He had dated Diane for a little over a year before their relationship ended in the fall of 2003. Friends described the breakup as difficult but not acrimonious, at least not outwardly. When investigators first approached him roughly 48 hours into the search, Michael was cooperative. He provided a detailed account of his whereabouts on the afternoon of May 3rd, claiming he had been at his apartment, roughly 90 minutes from the fairgrounds, working on a home renovation project. A neighbor confirmed seeing his car in the parking lot around 2 p.m. Another recalled hearing what sounded like power tools sometime that afternoon, though she could not specify exactly when. It was, on paper, a workable alibi, imperfect, as most real alibis are, but not contradictory enough to elevate him above the dozens of other names investigators were working through in those first frantic days. Detective Delgado's team also interviewed several of Michael's co-workers, who described him almost uniformly as reserved but professional, a man who kept largely to himself outside of work hours. One co-worker mentioned, in an offhand comment that would only take on significance much later, that Michael had recently expressed frustration about starting over somewhere nobody knew his story, a phrase that, at the time, seemed like nothing more than the ordinary language of heartbreak. The renovation project Michael claimed to have been working on that afternoon was real. Investigators confirmed purchases of drywall and paint from a local hardware store dated several days earlier. What they could not confirm, and what would trouble the case file for years afterward, was any independent verification that Michael had remained inside his apartment for the entire window between 3:00 and 4:30 p.m., a gap of roughly 90 minutes during which no witness could account for his precise location. Still, something about the interview stayed with the lead detective on the case, a 22-year veteran named Frank Delgado, who would later describe Michael's demeanor as cooperative to an almost rehearsed degree. It was a subjective impression, not evidence, and Delgado was careful to note in his own reports that instinct alone couldn't justify further scrutiny without something concrete behind it. That concrete evidence never materialized. Michael's phone records showed no unusual activity. His bank statements revealed no suspicious withdrawals in the weeks surrounding the disappearance. His vehicle, when eventually inspected with the family's knowledge, showed no forensic indication of having transported a child. Would you have suspected him, based on nothing more than a feeling in a detective's gut? It's worth sitting with that question, because it's precisely the kind of uncertainty that defines so many real investigations. The difference between suspicion and proof, and the ethical and legal boundary that separates the two. Weeks turned into months. The task force assigned to Lucas's case grew smaller, as other cases demanded attention, though it was never formally closed. Detective Delgado continued reviewing the file periodically, revisiting witness statements, cross-referencing sex offender registries within a 100-mile radius, and following up on tips that arrived, at their peak, at a rate of nearly a dozen a day. None of them led anywhere. A woman in Ohio claimed to have seen a boy matching Lucas's description at a rest stop. The child, when located, turned out to be someone else's grandson. Go Trucker reported picking up hitchhikers near the Maine, New Hampshire border weeks after the disappearance. None matched any known description. A psychic contacted the family directly, offering a vision of a wooded area near a lake. Searchers investigated 3 separate lakes based on her description before ruling it out entirely. By the 6-month mark, national media coverage had largely moved on. Though Lucas's case remained active in regional outlets and within the missing children's advocacy community, where his photograph, an age-progressed sketch updated annually, became a familiar fixture at conferences and awareness events for years afterward. One detail buried in the case file and never fully resolved would resurface 15 years later with devastating clarity. During his initial interview, Michael had mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd recently taken an interest in international relocation services, citing a desire for a fresh start after the breakup. At the time, it registered as nothing more than the ordinary restlessness of a man processing a difficult breakup. No one connected it to anything more significant. There was no reason to. Investigators closed out their active pursuit of leads roughly 14 months after Lucas vanished, though the file remained formally open, as is standard in unsolved cases involving minors. Robert and Diane were informed, gently but honestly, that without new evidence, the investigation had reached the limits of what conventional police work could uncover. For a case built entirely on absence, no witness, no ransom, no confirmed vehicle, no forensic trace, there was, in truth, very little left to pursue. What remained was a family learning to live inside a question mark, and a country slowly moving on from a story it would eventually forget, even as the Carters never could. In the years that followed, Detective Delgado made a habit of pulling the Carter file each May, reviewing it privately even after official resources had been reassigned elsewhere. He has said, since retiring, that certain cases simply refuse to leave a person's mind, not because of any evidence pointing definitively in one direction, but because of the particular ache of an ending that was never actually written. For Delgado, that ache had a name attached to it, even if he could never prove it belonged there. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself with a funeral, a particular kind of loss that never receives the closure a death provides. Robert and Diane Carter learned to live inside that specific absence for the better part of 15 years, and the shape it took in their daily life was, in many ways, more haunting than any single dramatic moment. Lucas's bedroom remained exactly as it had been on the morning of May 3, 2004. The same dinosaur bedspread, the same small collection of wooden trucks lined up along the windowsill. Diane dusted the room every week for the first several years, then every month, then, eventually, whenever grief demanded a task to occupy her hands. Robert never asked her to stop. There were, of course, harder years than others. The 10th anniversary of Lucas's disappearance brought a wave of renewed media attention, including a televised retrospective that reopened wounds the Carters had spent a decade learning to manage. Diane has since described that particular spring as one of the lowest points of the entire ordeal, not because anything new had happened, but because reliving the story publicly again without resolution felt at the time like confirmation that resolution might never come at all. Neither of them ever discussed changing it into something else, an office, a guest room, anything practical. It simply remained a physical pause button on a childhood that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Every May 3rd they marked his birthday. Not with parties, but with quiet rituals, a cake always chocolate, because it had been his favorite at 4 years old, even though neither of them knew what he might prefer now. They would light a single candle, sit together in the kitchen and allow themselves for one evening to imagine him older. 10 years old, 14, 18. The FBI's National Center for Missing and Exploited Children produced periodic age progression images throughout those years, each one an educated approximation, built from facial recognition software and family photographs, projecting what Lucas might look like as he aged. The Carters kept every version, taped chronologically inside a closet door that only they ever opened. 9 years old, then 12, then 16, then 18, a strange visual timeline of a childhood reconstructed entirely from probability rather than memory. What none of those images could account for, of course, was language, culture, the particular way a person's face settles into new expressions shaped by an unfamiliar life. Because while the Carters marked birthdays in a preserved bedroom in Maine, roughly 3,800 miles away, a boy who had once answered to the name Lucas was growing up under a different name entirely, in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Lyon, France, believing, with the complete unquestioning certainty of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt, that the man raising him was his biological father. Michael Dawson, using falsified identification obtained through a document forgery network he'd connected with in the months following his breakup with Diane, had relocated to France within 8 months of Lucas's disappearance. He changed his own name, established a modest but consistent employment history, and enrolled the boy in school under a fabricated birth certificate that listed a fictional deceased mother, a detail Michael would repeat so consistently over so many years that even he seemed to internalize it as a kind of alternate truth. The boy grew up without violence. This detail matters, and investigators would later emphasize it carefully in their reports, not to soften the severity of the crime, but because it illuminated the particular psychology behind it. Michael had not taken Lucas out of cruelty in the traditional sense. He had taken him out of an obsessive inability to let go of a life he believed should have been his. And having taken him, he built an entire fabricated existence designed to erase every trace of what came before. Lucas, known in France by another name entirely, attended local schools, played on a youth football team, and by all appearances lived an unremarkable, even comfortable childhood. He occasionally asked about his mother. He was always given the same gentle, rehearsed answer. She had died when he was very small, and it made his father sad to talk about her, so it was better not to ask. Children, especially those raised with consistency and affection, rarely question the architecture of their own reality. Lucas had no reason to suspect that the man he called his father had built their entire life together on a foundation of abduction and fraud. Back in Maine, the case grew quieter with each passing year, though it never fully disappeared. Diane became involved with a national organization supporting families of missing children, eventually speaking at the very kind of conference that would, in 2019, bring her and Robert to Paris. Robert channeled his grief differently, volunteering with a local search and rescue unit, training scent dogs, driven by a need to be useful in a world that had, 15 years earlier, made him feel entirely powerless. Neither of them ever stopped believing Lucas was alive. They couldn't have explained why exactly. No evidence supported that belief more than any other possibility. It was simply a certainty they carried quietly, through 15 birthdays, 15 candles, 15 years of a bedroom that never changed. Meanwhile, in Lyon, the boy who no longer answered to the name Lucas was approaching the end of adolescence, preparing for his final exams, applying for a part-time position at a regional airport for the summer before university. An ordinary next step in an ordinary young life, chosen with no awareness that it would place him one autumn morning directly in the path of two people who had spent 15 years searching a country he didn't know for a son he didn't know he was. We return now to where this story began, the terminal, the crowd, and a mother who could not make her feet move. Diane would later describe the moment not as recognition in the traditional sense, but as something closer to a physical sensation, a wrongness in the air that preceded conscious thought. She noticed the shape of the young man's face before she consciously registered why it mattered, the particular slope of his jaw, a slight tilt of the head when he smiled at a confused traveler, angling it just so, a mannerism so specific, so unchanged since childhood, that it bypassed rational analysis entirely and struck something older, more instinctive. Then she saw it. A small, irregular birthmark, just visible beneath the edge of his hairline behind his left ear. It was a detail so specific, so unlikely to be replicated by coincidence, that Diane felt something close to vertigo, the strange, disorienting sensation of a single physical fact colliding with 15 years of trained skepticism. She had, after all, seen dozens of boys over the years who resembled the age progression sketches taped inside her closet door. She had learned, painfully, not to trust resemblance alone. But a birthmark in that exact location was not resemblance, it was specificity. Robert, following his wife's frozen gaze, needed a few seconds longer to understand what he was looking at, but once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The same birthmark he had watched a pediatrician point out during Lucas's very first checkup 20 years earlier. Neither of them approached the young man directly. 15 years of false leads, false sightings, and shattered hope had taught them painfully the danger of certainty without evidence. Instead, shaking, they approached an airport security officer nearby and explained, as calmly as they could manage, who they believed they had just seen. What would you have done in that moment and approached him immediately, or held back the way the Carters did, terrified of being wrong one more time? It's worth considering, because the choice they made, restraint, procedure, patience, is precisely what allowed the truth to be established properly, rather than chaotically. French airport police, informed of the situation, treated the claim with appropriate seriousness, rather than dismissing it as an overwrought coincidence. A possibility that admittedly crosses many investigators' minds in cases involving decades-old age progression comparisons. Rather than confronting the young employee immediately, officers quietly requested his identification under the pretext of a routine document check, standard procedure for airport personnel, and initiated contact with the FBI's International Liaison Office in Paris. The young man, who identified himself using a name that meant nothing to the Carters, a name built entirely from Michael's fabricated paperwork, cooperated without apparent concern. He had no reason to suspect anything unusual. He had shown similar documents dozens of times before. It was within those documents that the first inconsistency surfaced. His birth certificate, issued in a small French municipality, had technically been filed nearly 3 years after the birth date it listed, an administrative anomaly not entirely uncommon among certain immigration and residency cases, but unusual enough to warrant a closer look, particularly once cross-referenced against French medical registries, which showed no record of any hospital birth, vaccination history, or early pediatric visits under that name prior to age 5. A child, in other words, who appeared to have entered official existence sometime around 2005, nearly a year after Lucas Carter had vanished from a playground in Maine. French investigators were careful throughout this process to avoid informing the young employee's employer of the reason behind the sudden document review, wary of disrupting his ordinary daily life until there was something concrete enough to justify doing so. He continued working his usual shifts throughout that week, unaware that 2 American investigators and a growing team of French officials were quietly building a case around his identity. Investigators moved carefully over the following 72 hours, aware of both the sensitivity of the situation and the very real possibility that they were pursuing an extraordinary coincidence rather than an extraordinary truth. Biometric facial comparison software, cross-referencing childhood photographs of Lucas, provided by the Carters against current images of the young airport employee, returned a compatibility score high enough to move the case into formal investigative territory. The Carters, informed of this preliminary result, described the following 72 hours as the longest of their entire lives, longer even than the initial days of the search in 2004. Because this time, hope had a face attached to it, a face that might, at any moment, prove to belong to someone else's son entirely. On the fourth day, with judicial authorization secured through cooperation between French authorities and the FBI, a DNA sample was collected from the young man, alongside reference samples the Carters had provided years earlier and kept on file with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, specifically for a moment like this one. A moment they had imagined for 15 years without ever quite believing it would come. The young man, for his part, cooperated with the same calm compliance he had shown throughout the process, still under the impression that this was simply an unusually thorough administrative procedure. He would later describe, in reflections shared long after the truth had fully settled, a vague unease during those days. Not suspicion exactly, but the sense that the adults around him were treating an ordinary document check with a gravity that didn't quite make sense. He had no framework yet for understanding why. The DNA results arrived 11 days after the initial encounter at Charles de Gaulle Airport. The match was unambiguous. The probability of paternal and maternal relation exceeded 99%. The boy the Carters had watched grow up only in age progression sketches taped inside a closet door was, without question, their son. Detective Delgado, informed of the result during his retirement, has said he sat in silence for several minutes afterward. 15 years of an unresolved file, a lingering instinct he could never substantiate, and finally, an answer arriving not through anything he had done, but through two exhausted parents looking up at the right second in a crowded terminal. For Robert and Diane, the confirmation brought a grief-shaped relief that neither had anticipated, a joy so large it registered at first, almost as shock, indistinguishable in the body from fear. Diane later said she cried for nearly an hour before she was able to speak a coherent sentence to the investigator who delivered the news. Robert has described that same hour differently, not tears at first, but a strange numbness, as though 15 years of bracing for disappointment had left him temporarily unable to process good news at all. It took, he has said, nearly a full day before the reality settled somewhere he could actually feel it. For Lucas, and here the narrative shifts necessarily into his own experience of that same discovery, the news arrived as something closer to an earthquake beneath a life he had never once questioned. He was brought in for what he believed was still part of a routine document clarification. Instead, he was gently, carefully informed by a joint team of French and American investigators, alongside a child psychologist experienced in reunification cases, that the man he had called his father for as long as he could remember was not his father at all. That his mother had not died when he was small, that she was in fact alive and had spent 15 years searching for him. Investigators who were present in the room described his reaction as initial disbelief, followed by a kind of quiet internal collapse, not dramatic, not loud, but the visible unraveling of a person watching the entire architecture of their identity dissolve in real time. The psychologist present in that room later noted, in professional reflections shared with the investigative team, that reunification cases involving very young children at the time of abduction present a unique challenge. Unlike older children who might retain conscious memory of their original family, a 4-year-old's sense of identity is still being formed, meaning the fabricated life essentially became the only psychological foundation the child ever consciously built upon. He had memories, he told them, though he'd never understood what they meant. A park with a green slide, a red bicycle he couldn't place geographically. A woman's voice, humming something he couldn't name, in a language that felt in the memory warmer than French. He had always assumed these were simply early childhood fragments, disconnected and unreliable, the way most people's earliest memories are. They weren't fragments. They were the last remaining threads of a life interrupted at 4 years old. Michael Dawson, apprehended by French authorities within days of the DNA confirmation, still working under his fabricated identity, did not resist arrest. According to investigators present during his initial interrogation, he appeared in a strange way, almost relieved, as though 15 years of sustaining an elaborate fiction had exhausted something in him that he no longer had the will to protect. His confession, given over the course of several sessions with French and American investigators present, described a plan conceived not in a single moment of impulse, but developed gradually over the months following his breakup with Diane. He described an inability to accept the end of the relationship, an obsessive conviction that separating Lucas from his mother would somehow erase the life he felt had been unfairly taken from him. He had researched international relocation options, connected, through channels he described only vaguely, unwilling or unable to name specific individuals, with a document forgery network capable of producing convincing identification, and spent months planning the logistics of removing a 4-year-old from a public event without drawing attention. He insisted throughout his confession that Lucas had never been harmed, a claim investigators were able to substantiate through medical examinations and interviews. This detail, while offering no legal mitigation for the severity of his crimes, would later factor meaningfully into the psychological reunification process Lucas underwent. The understanding that his childhood, however built on deception, had not been marked by cruelty in the way so many similar cases tragically are. How do you imagine it feels to learn that an entire lifetime of ordinary memories, birthdays, football practice, bedtime stories was constructed on top of someone else's unbearable loss? It's a question without a comfortable answer, and Lucas himself, according to those who worked closely with him during this period, spent months simply trying to locate language for something no one else he knew had ever experienced. Michael was formally charged with international parental kidnapping, though the term felt inadequate, given the absence of any biological parental claim, document fraud, and multiple charges related to the falsification of identity records spanning both French and American jurisdictions. He did not contest the charges. For the first time since May 3, 2004, the case of Lucas Carter had a complete evidence-based answer. What remained now was not investigation, but the far more difficult work of two families, one legally severed, one biologically real, learning to make sense of a boy caught permanently between them. French social services assigned Lucas a dedicated caseworker in the weeks following Michael's arrest, tasked with helping him navigate a legal and emotional landscape with no real precedent in his own life experience. He was, at once, a victim of an extraordinary crime and a young adult who had lost in days both the only father he had ever known and the entire narrative structure of his own childhood. Reunions like this one do not resemble the tearful cinematic embraces so often imagined by people who have never lived through one. Investigators and psychologists who specialize in long-term reunification cases are careful to prepare families for this reality, and the Carters, despite 15 years of imagining this exact moment, found themselves unprepared for how complicated it actually felt. Their first meeting with Lucas took place away from cameras, away from the press that had, understandably, taken enormous interest in the case once details began to surface. It happened in a quiet room arranged by French social services, with a psychologist present, in a setting designed to remove pressure from all three people in it. The room itself, according to those who helped arrange it, was deliberately unremarkable. Soft chairs, neutral colors, a window overlooking an ordinary courtyard, nothing that might heighten the emotional weight of a moment already carrying more weight than any room could reasonably hold. Psychologists who specialize in reunification cases often insist on this kind of quiet neutrality, precisely because families in this situation tend to arrive already overwhelmed by 15 years of imagined versions of a meeting that could never actually match what real life delivers. Diane has since described the moment not as recognition, but as a kind of careful mutual observation, two parents looking at a young man who was, unmistakably, their son and also undeniably a stranger shaped by 19 years they had played no part in. Robert has said, in the rare interviews the family agreed to afterward, that the hardest part wasn't the silence in that first meeting. It was resisting the urge to fill it, to rush toward a closeness that 15 years of separation had made impossible to simply will into existence. Lucas, for his part, has spoken carefully and sparingly about that period, understandably protective of an experience that remains in many ways still being processed. What has been shared through statements released with his permission describes a slow, deliberate process. Letters exchanged before phone calls before video meetings before he felt ready to travel to Maine for the first time. Nearly 8 months after the DNA confirmation, he did eventually stand in the bedroom that had waited for him for 15 years. According to those close to the family, he said very little during that visit, simply stood for a long time near the window, looking at the small wooden truck still lined up exactly where a 4-year-old had left them one Saturday morning in May. 15 years do not disappear in a single embrace, and no one involved in Lucas's reunification pretended otherwise. What began instead was something slower and in its own way more durable, a relationship built not on the childhood that had been stolen, but on whatever new version of family the three of them could construct from where they now stood. Lucas has since then divided his time between France, where he completed his education and maintained the friendships and community that had shaped his adolescence, and Maine, where he has slowly built a relationship with the biological family he never knew he had. It is, by every account, an ongoing process rather than a resolved one, which is perhaps the most honest kind of ending a story like this can offer. Michael Dawson's trial concluded in early 2021. He was convicted on all counts, including international parental kidnapping, extensive document fraud, and falsification of identity records across 2 countries. The sentencing, handled through a coordinated agreement between French and American judicial authorities, resulted in a lengthy prison term to be served in the United States. Robert has since described the trial itself as strangely anticlimactic, not because it lacked emotional weight, but because by the time it concluded, so much of the family's grief had already been processed through the far more personal work of simply learning how to sit in a room with their son again. The courtroom, in a sense, formalized a resolution that had already begun quietly months earlier, in that small room with the soft chairs and the ordinary courtyard view. For investigators who had worked the case in its earliest days, some of whom had long since retired, having carried the file's unresolved weight for years, the final resolution offered a rare and genuine sense of closure. Detective Frank Delgado, reached years after his retirement, said simply that he had never stopped thinking about that instinct he'd felt during Michael's first interview in 2004, the sense that something didn't fit, even without proof to support it. It would take 15 years, an ocean, and an entirely unrelated conference for that instinct to finally be vindicated. What strikes investigators most, looking back on this case, isn't the sophistication of the deception, nor the scale of the search that followed Lucas's disappearance. It's the sheer improbability of the resolution, that of all the ways a 15-year-old mystery might have ended, it ended with 2 exhausted parents walking through an airport on an ordinary Tuesday, catching sight of a young man's face among thousands of strangers, and simply knowing. We'd genuinely like to hear what you think. Would you have trusted your instincts in that terminal the way Diane did? Let us know in the comments. These conversations are part of what makes this community worth returning to. Before we close, we want to be transparent with you, the way we try to be at the end of every story here on Archive 26. This narrative was a fictional account, inspired by the real emotional patterns found in long-term missing persons cases, and created for entertainment and reflection rather than as a depiction of actual events or individuals. If it left you thinking about the families who live with real, unresolved disappearances, that reflection is exactly what we hope these stories can offer. Thank you, sincerely, for spending this time with us. If this story moved you, we'd appreciate a like, and if investigative stories like this one speak to you, consider subscribing. There are more archived cases waiting to be told.